Media at McGill is a hub of research, scholarship, and public outreach on issues and controversies in media, technology, and culture. Visit us online at media.mcgill.ca.
That name was the total domination of one party. They were one-party states, and one-party states meant one dominant newspaper and one dominant state television network, and that's what gave the news. And most people in those countries didn't believe a word of what they read. That's a fact. And because of that, within the Western world, it was considered absolutely normal and natural to have a media which reflected different opinions, including very radical opinions, and one reason for that was to hold it up, this example, to the world which lay on the other side and said, in our country, people who are opposed to the government and even strongly opposed find voices on television, radio, and the national newspapers, the print media. And so you can see a very different way of reporting which emerged. I mean, I will just give you one example from the United States, that during the Vietnam War, the reporting in some of the print media, the New York Times correspondent Halberstam, who was sending in reports from the battlefields of Vietnam, the quality of this reporting was quite extraordinary. And if you look at what the television reporting was, I can still remember one image very, very clearly, which was repeated on the BBC when we were young and agitating against the war in Vietnam, and this was Morley Safer, the correspondent in Vietnam of CBS, reporting from the jungles where Marines were about to torch a house with women and children in it, and Morley Safer filmed this entire operation and then actually said, this is what, when I asked the Marine commander, he said, this is a fight for freedom. I mean, you didn't need to say anything else. And that level of reporting on television has virtually disappeared, certainly in the Western media. You don't get it. And the contrast is very pronounced. And one reason is they don't have to convince anyone in any other part of the world about how great the media is compared to anything else, because the media is by and large the same in most parts of the world, though not all, as we shall discuss in a moment. And so it's quite instructive to look at the media in relation to the three different conflicts that are shaping, reshaping, destabilizing the Middle East. The first, of course, is Iraq. If you look at how the war in Iraq has been covered, it's completely different from coverage given to previous wars. This process started with the first Gulf War and has now reached its sort of apogee with the current war in Iraq, where the actual phrase used as the only trustworthy journalists are embedded journalists. And embedded journalists are those totally dependent on the Western armies in Iraq, who don't step outside the zones controlled by these armies and who don't do anything without asking the PR relations people of the various armies there whether they can do this or not. The bulk of the reporting comes like that. Occasionally, you have 2 or 3 brave journalists who break the routine, but by and large, that's what the reporting is. So you do not get a complete or an everyday account of what is happening in the country. And I don't need to mention now, because this is so well known that it's almost a cliche to repeat it, that all the mainstream papers in the Western world, by and large, bought Bush's line on weapons of mass destruction, and in the United States bought the line which no European paper could buy because it was too fantastical for words, that one reason for invading Iraq was of Saddam Hussein's links with Al-Qaeda. I mean, when the United States came up with that, the entire Arab world roared with laughter, because anyone with a tiny bit of knowledge knew that Saddam and Al-Qaeda loathed each other, absolutely hated each other. And Al-Qaeda did not exist in Iraq under the previous regime. It went in with the occupation. Essentially, that's a fact. So no one believed that, so the European papers couldn't carry that line. In the United States, it was carried. On the main networks, Fox Television, the main print media, two lines went in tandem. He has weapons of mass destruction and is a friend of Al-Qaeda. This was repeated ad nauseam. And when it was challenged, people who challenged it were accused of being apologists for the regime, saying, why are you challenging this? It's a well-known fact. We now know, and the New York Times officially made an apology to its readers, we were misled. But you weren't just misled. You weren't just misled, you made no effort to investigate whether this was true or not. That's the problem. You can certainly publish the views of the government, you have to, but you must preserve independence. You must have a team of journalists who go and investigate whether this was true or not. And that investigation did not happen. And when a BBC journalist, as it so happens, a right-wing BBC journalist, Andrew Gilligan, more or less said on the BBC's main current affairs show today that nobody really believed in these weapons of mass destruction and the whole dossier had been rigged by the intelligence networks, which turned out to be true, he was fired. And then as the war began to unfold, you began to see a slightly different nature of reporting. They only wanted you to report, and they only wanted you to see what was completely under their control. Journalists who went outside military control, Western military control, were often found dead. More journalists have died in the Iraq War than in previous wars since the last 25 years. And many of them were killed in accidental fire by the US Marines. So the act of trying to step outside, I mean, you know, Seymour Hersh, Robert Fisk, and a few other intrepid souls carried on. They carried on reporting. But not everyone did, because your life could be at risk if you actually went in search for the truth. And so what has happened to Iraq, we only know through alternative sources. That 1 million Iraqis have died. When the British medical magazine Lancet first said about 2 years ago that using the same methods we use to ascertain casualties during times of famine or civil wars, we have used exactly the same methods, and our team has said, this was 2 years ago, that up to 600,000 Iraqi civilians have died since the US occupation. There was shock horror. Tony Blair denounced them, the Americans denounced them. A year later they said, well, these figures were accurate. And if those figures were accurate 2 years ago, then the deaths now must be above 1 million. So 1 million people have died in Iraq. There are over 2 million refugees flooding neighboring countries. The social infrastructure of that country has collapsed. The education system doesn't function. The health system doesn't function. There is no electricity in Baghdad for most of the day. But this is not reported, because countries which do this to other countries are usually called, in these days, especially when the word genocide is bandied about and used in a very cavalier fashion. But that is the appellation that is normally applied to it, that this is genocidal and that the politicians carrying out or responsible for this are war criminals and should be tried. But there is a set of double standards in operation, that such an appellation is only applied to people who are enemies of the West at a particular given point. and not to politicians belonging to the West, even though